Last but not least, we have Jesse Goldshear.
All right, thanks everybody for coming to all of these talks. The previous speakers were all incredible. I'm really excited to present this research to you as it was part of my recent dissertation. So this is the negative impact of targeted encampment sweeps on the ontological security of unhoused people who use drugs. Just to start with some acknowledgements, I really want to thank all the participants in my study. As you'll see, they shared a lot of really deep and vulnerable information with me, so they deserve a lot of thanks. My community advisory board of community experts really helped me figure out interview questions and also troubleshoot a lot of stuff I was doing in the field. Then there's my dissertation committee chaired by Ricky Blumenthal and NIDA, who helped fund this project. So I'll go through the background really fast because my results will take a bit. So in Los Angeles, there are over 80,000 unhoused residents in LA County. This is probably an undercount. The last point in time estimate showed that this was an increase from 2019. And despite these rising numbers of unhoused residents in our county, City Council has been passing a wide variety of anti-houseless legislation, including what I call sweeps, or what other people might refer to as displacement. People who use drugs among this group may be targeted more frequently for sweeps, whether that's because there's heavy police presence, whether that's because neighbors are calling the cops on unhoused people in their neighborhood. But so there's reason to think that this group in particular is especially vulnerable to being displaced when they're living outside. And in general, living outdoors and in places that are not meant for human habitation has multiple negative impacts on people's health. From environmental exposures to pollution, unsanitary water, and a variety of other things like traffic noise. It also worsens chronic health conditions that people might have and exacerbates mental illness. Unhoused people, and especially unhoused people who use drugs, are subject to extreme social stigma from broader society and isolated from a lot of the things that we take for granted. The main outcome here that I'll be looking at is ontological security, which was defined in both the psychology and then subsequently sociology literature as this continuity of one's self-identity, how you think and feel about yourself in relation to the world around you, and how stable you feel in your social and physical environments. Two scholars, Dupuy and Thorne, postulated that this has four kind of key components: material consistency and social trust, the routines that you build in your daily life, feelings of privacy and freedom from surveillance by others, and then your own identity and actualization on your goals. And if you can achieve these things, you are an ontologically secure person. So how did I conduct this study? I used two qualitative methods paired. So first, I embedded myself with a mutual aid organization where I live on the west side. We provide things like harm reduction supplies, food, water, clothing, tents, etc. to residents in our neighborhood. And while with that organization every week, I rotated through a variety of unhoused encampments on the west side and in the southwest of Los Angeles for a total of about 230 hours over 2 years. I also conducted 30 semi-structured interviews with participants at those sites and in Hollywood at a syringe services organization. To be eligible for those, you had to be over 18, spending time outdoors, and having used any illicit substance in the prior week when I spoke to them. These interviews lasted 45 minutes to 2 hours at their longest. I was the only interviewer and the only coder for this data, so that introduces some bias. I didn't have anybody else looking at these with me. And I collected these via incentivized peer referral, so ideally it looked like this, where one person could refer 3 people who could then refer 3 more people. In actuality, it was a lot messier than that, but this was the ideal. So what are some results? I'm going to break these down by each of those 4 kind of core markers and present a single key quote for each one. In my dissertation defense, I had many more quotes, but that would take a long time here. So first up, demographics. The sample was around 38 years old on average, mostly male and racially pretty diverse. About a third of the sample identified as mixed race, and a little less than that as white. About a third of the sample had less than a high school education or GED equivalent, but almost 50% of the sample had been living outside for 10 years or longer. These results might be different for people that haven't been living outside as long, but I just want to make sure that this particular limitation is clear. So first is that material and social constancy piece. So I found that sweeps themselves were highly destructive to people's sense of material and social constancy in the world around them. The items that they lost during these sweeps set participants back psychologically and in obtaining services if they were forced to move further away from organizations that they had been working with, like case management services. This type of displacement, even if only temporary, was highly destabilizing, extremely frustrating, and in some cases led participants to use more than they had been before they were swept. But all the photos here I took, and I tried to avoid people's faces if people were in the photos at all. So this is Claudia, and all names here are changed for privacy. So this is what Claudia had to say. I've lost things that belong to people that meant the world to me that are no longer here anymore. You know, things that remind me of them that they once touched. I've lost some pictures of my family. I lost birth certificates and social security cards, IDs. I've lost tents. You know, everything that went inside the tents, the only things that I had. Sweeps were also really destructive and disruptive to people's sense of daily, weekly, and long-term routine and planning. Sweeps themselves were highly variable in timing, though most occurred in the morning. But the duration and destructiveness of the sweeps also varied. Some sweeps were just spot cleanings and nobody had to move. Other sweeps were complete banishment from a given area with high police presence and threat of arrest if people didn't comply. This also disrupted people's hustles and ways of making money. It disrupted their substance use routines. And then this had knock-on effects later down the line when I followed up with people, a year later. They'd missed appointments with case managers. They'd missed appointments with substance use treatment. And this created even more problems further on. I'm going to skip Gerard's quote here, and I want to go right to the last piece, because I think this is important. So sweeps also engendered feelings of hopelessness, pessimism, and limited people's goals for the future. Giving up and feelings of abandonment by the rest of society were expressed by nearly everybody. And this cycle of starting over constantly every time they lost their things really ground people's willpower down to the point where they didn't really want to engage with any services anymore. And I just want to end with this quote by Dolan. So Dolan had this to say, usually it's like, okay, what do I got to do to replace it? Can I afford it? Most of the time I can't. It shakes us up to where it takes away our focus on what we need. If I got certain things that I needed and take care of, I've got a clean area, I got water, I'm managing everything on my own, I maintain it. They want to come and take all of that. When all that stuff is gone, you just feel defeated. You feel like whenever you strive to try and do better, you don't get what you need. And just overall, among this group, these encampment clearances and displacement measures clearly severely negatively impacted ontological security. But even more than that, it caused unhoused Angelenos in our community to lose trust in a system that they expect to help them, but largely just punishes them for being poor and for using drugs. This also leads to a reduced sense of personal agency and autonomy, and therefore capacity to exit the situation that they're in. When people are swept constantly and they constantly have to start over and over and over, there's no way for them to escape the world that they have found themselves in. And I just want to end with this final photo. You can see this person trying to get back to their things, but are being stopped. So thank you. You can contact me here. My sources were too many to list, but if you would like to know more about the topic, please feel free to reach out. And here's some Q&A. Thank you.
Any questions?
I see a couple hands. I can hear you okay from up here.
Okay, so my question, sorry. This is so fascinating, and before we can, really move on to kind of change some of these things, we have to understand what's happening, right, and how it impacts people, and all of the great work that you're doing. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about where we go from here, right? This stuff that you show is just heartbreaking. How do we fix this?
It's a great question, and I want to say that this is a really clear example of community members and advocates that work with this community being really far ahead of the research. So, I'm here pointing out all these problems, but the fact is, if you spend time in these communities, or if you're a member of these communities, you already know all of this. And so a lot of the work that these mutual aid organizations are doing, besides just providing material items, is providing solidarity and advocacy and helping these people get their voices heard by our policymakers. So we actually do a lot of work contacting councilmen and councilwomen to talk about sweep policies in their district. We try and advocate publicly for them and allow people to advocate for themselves during open meetings. And so I think that kind of in that way, this change is already starting to happen, even if slowly. There's also the legal route. So interestingly enough, during COVID, there was a legal decision that barred the city from conducting sweeps at all. But that moratorium has since ended. And so there is already some legal precedent, and I think that there's some work going on trying to bring more court cases up. So I just want to say, I'm here to point out problems, but the fact is those problems are already being worked on by the community because they are the experts and they're ahead of us on that.
So you mentioned that with the interviews, you could only interview people who hadn't used illicit substance in the past week.
Yeah.
And I completely understand why you needed to use that exclusion criteria, but I'm wondering what your opinion is with the high rates of substance abuse and addiction in unhoused populations. Do you think that that's excluding a significant kind of perspective on these issues by leaving out persons that haven't used or that don't have the ability to stop using illicit substances for a week before the interview?
That's a great question. So I'll clarify a little more because maybe I wasn't clear. So I only interviewed people who are actively using, and in several cases, people had used really close to the interview, and I could tell. I didn't prevent them from being interviewed unless they were incredibly intoxicated and couldn't consent. But I agree, this does limit the perspectives I was getting. I think the last estimate I saw was that maybe 35% of unhoused people in Los Angeles County indicated substance use or a substance use disorder. So there really is a huge chunk of that population that I was not focused on. And so I think that that's kind of a benefit and a limitation to this study. And on one hand, the study's more specific because it's a more specific population. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right. People that don't use might be living in different circumstances than people who do. They might be subject to these policies in a different way. They might interface with services differently. And so absolutely, I think that there's definitely room to conduct a very similar study and using very similar interview questions, but with this other group of people. And I think it would be a really interesting comparison to see, does substance use itself impact the outcome that I was looking at? Absolutely. I think that's a great question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say first, this is really amazing. I actually saw a sweep happening on my way to work today. So this is definitely something that's happening a lot. I think it's really great work that you're doing. I was kind of curious about what your experience was kind of working to recruit this population for your work, because I imagine rightfully so, they're definitely a little bit distrustful of people that have more privilege, because we're often the ones looking down on them or even conducting these sweeps. So I was just wondering what that was like, kind of gaining their trust and talking to them about this stuff.
Sure. So I think that one of the advantages to ethnography is that you spend a lot of time with the people you end up collecting data from. And so the way that I chose to spend that time was with a group that was providing a community service. And I will say absolutely, at first, we had zero trust. When I started doing this, I started distributing harm reduction supplies first from a backpack riding around on my bike, and then once I had a lot of supplies from the trunk of my car, everybody thought I was a cop for months. Understandably. They were like, why are you coming here on your bike giving out needles? Like, what is going on? But eventually, I just kept showing up. I kept talking to people. I made them aware that I was interested in just being there to help the community with the expertise that I had. And then once I started doing the research end of it, because the research came second. I initially started doing this without wanting to turn it into a project at all. Once I started doing the research end of it, I made everybody aware, like, hey, here's what I do. I'm interested in collecting this kind of data. You know, I'm going to take notes when I'm here if that's cool. And so eventually it just kind of turned into something that worked, but it took a while to gain that trust. And even now, even when the group that I'm with, I ended up partnering with another group, there's still people that don't trust us. And it's been 3 years of this work at this point. It's just kind of the nature of how it goes. And I will say, to a bit of a different point, during my interviews, there were definitely experiences that people wouldn't share with me. I think that I got a lot of good data. People did people did talk about things that would, I think, reflect negatively upon them for other people. You know, they talked about having to steal from folks to get by, having to engage in all sorts of other illegal activities. But there were definitely things that, because of who I am and what I look like and the power dynamic of that interview, people wouldn't share with me. I will say, especially the women that I interviewed, even the ones that I find that I'm pretty close with, there were definitely aspects of their past. They were like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that with you. So I think that gaining trust was a process, but then getting them to do an interview and accepting the fact that some of the questions I asked were just not going to get answered was a big part of that process. And I see one hand all the way in the back if we have time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. I just wondering if within your research group, you have also some branches that also talk with the people that is being also affected by the homelessness phenomenon. Let's say if your house is right across one of these encampments, you are affected too. Mm-hmm. So do you have part of your research team that is interviewing that part of the society? And also, if I know that within the police departments, there are groups that try to solve these problems too. They try to help them. Do you interview them as well to have the different views? Because I see your view and I totally agree, but I just wonder if you have different branches touching each side of the story.
Sure, that's a great question. So for the purposes of this research, given the funding and the time that I had, I really only focused on the perspectives of this population. That being said, because of the structure of Los Angeles governance, and so we have all these neighborhood councils, right? I ended up sitting through probably 30 or 40 neighborhood council meetings for different neighborhoods on the west side. My notes on them are a little limited because they were incredibly long and it was hard to pay attention. But one thing that I did learn was the perspective of a lot of the neighbors that live near these encampment sites. They were all very vocal during these meetings. So I think the problem is that the perspective that I have on nearby neighbors is largely that they are very angry. They were furious during these neighborhood council meetings and often had a lot of disparaging things to say about this population. So I do have some of that perspective, but it's limited, frankly, to kind of the most vocal and most angry members of that community, and I don't want to generalize from that and say that that's how everybody that lives near these places feels. Because the fact is, for the first half of this study, I lived in a building literally opposite the corner from my main field site. I spoke to some of my neighbors about it, and they had very different things to say. Some of them were absolutely like, I want these people removed, I want them gone, I don't want to look at it anymore. I had other neighbors that were much more sympathetic, so I think views are mixed. When it comes to the police, I think there's some nuance there, but unfortunately, the view that I got of police actions during this study was largely that they were there to either find people to arrest on warrants, which was very common, and happened probably 3 or 4 times during my field studies. I'd be standing there talking to someone, and several police cruisers would just pull up to the encampment, and they'd hop out, search somebody's tent, and be like, oh, we got them on a warrant, and then arrest them. But on the other hand, I did get a lot of stories from folks I interviewed that had encounters with the police where the cops knew they were using, knew they had drugs on them, and let them go anyway, and didn't do anything about it. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that part of the data. I think I would have to do a more specific study, but unfortunately for the amount of time and money that I had to conduct interviews, I kind of just focused on this group. But in the future, I would like to talk to folks that are housed that live nearby, because again, I think their perspectives are mixed, and I'd like to know what their perspectives are.
Just want to offer a perspective of a fellow Angelino who's lived in LA for
Please
like
do.
20 plus years of my life. I definitely think that, like you said, there are very mixed reviews, and I think a lot of it stems from the lack of education the community actually doesn't receive about why these people are going through what they're going through. So just to kind of, if there's any understanding, that's why the people are angry and, you know, have more of a negative concept of this problem.
Thank you for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Jesse.
Thank you.